And so confident were people in the United States and other capitalist liberal democracies that great thinkers like Francis Fukuyama, he's a kind of a Western philosopher and a kind of a thinker who regularly comments on politics and so forth. He is quoted as saying, "What we may be witnessing is not the end of the Cold War, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of man's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy." Now you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, what he's saying is this, is that all of human history has been working towards capitalist liberal democracy. And we have now shown the superiority of that system. And so now that's it. There's not going to be any more progress in history because we're at the top. Capitalist liberal democracy, and it's implied, especially as that exists in the United States, is the best system that there possibly could be. There could be no system better. Right? Remember, after the defeat of fascism, the major ideological systems that people could follow were either capitalist liberal democracy or communism. Well, communism is gone now, right? And there's nothing else left. Right? There's nothing else left. So the capitalist liberal democracies have won. We are awesome. And that's the end of history. And of course, the people in this time period, including myself, said, well, now we just need to wait for communism to collapse in China, just like the Soviet Union. I mean, that's going to happen, right? I mean, won't communism collapse in China just like it did in the Soviet Union? And one thing I should stress about this is that we were really, 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 really wrong when we thought China would collapse just like the Soviet Union. Because not only has China not collapsed, right, it has developed into an economic powerhouse, a superpower that is able to, in a sense, rival the United States. So as a way of ending this course, we're going to look at how that happened and what that means for the world today. So to go back, right, in China, remember that there was a civil war between communists and nationalists, right? They kind of call it off during World War II when they're fighting the Japanese, sort of. They still kind of have some conflict and some fighting. But civil war will continue after World War II between the communists and nationalists. Mao Zedong, the man we talked about earlier, who is a leading figure in the Communist Party, has by this time become the leader of the Communist Party, and he will lead the communists to victory in 1949. And one thing I want to stress, and this is really striking about this victory, is that the Americans were supplying the nationalists. We were anti-communist. We were supplying the nationalists with lots of equipment, lots of money. We were giving them so much support. However, the communists won, right? So the nationalists have all this awesome weapons, all these awesome technology, but they had really bad morale. Like they did not believe in their cause nearly as deeply as the communists did. So the nationalist soldiers would run away and just abandon their weapons and technology and things like American tanks. And then the communists would just take those weapons and technology and tanks and use them to keep fighting the nationalists. So the victory, in a sense, was made possible by higher communist morale despite U.S. support for the nationalists. This is very important. So Mao Zedong saw that if he had the support of the people, especially villagers, especially the people in the countryside, even if he didn't have as good of technology and as good of weapons, the fact that those people believed so strongly in communism and their revolutionary fervor was so high, that was enough to overcome any technological problems. Any lack of resources, any lack of weapons could be overcome by revolutionary fervor and the support of the people. Right? So that's Mao Zedong's view. Well, that's going to become important momentarily. Now, what will happen, though, is the nationalists are defeated, but they're not destroyed. The nationalists will flee to the island of Taiwan in 1949, where Chiang Kai-shek will establish dictatorship, but later it will become a wealthy liberal democracy. And Taiwan's kind of an interesting case today because it is both China and Taiwan claim to be the only legitimate government of China. They maintain basically friendly relations, but Taiwan's kind of diplomatically isolated because of that, because you can't recognize both countries at the same time. There's only one, in a sense. Because they both claim to be the legitimate governments of China. But that doesn't stop the United States from selling lots and lots of weapons to Taiwan, which can create some deep kind of conflict between China and People's Republic of China, mainland China, and the United States, because we are arming, a part of their what both sides claim to be part of China, and preventing, in a sense, mainland China from coming in and just taking it. Though currently they're basically trying to economically integrate with Taiwan in hopes that eventually then it will just peacefully rejoin China under the rule of the communists. But that aside, right, in 1949, Mao Zedong has defeated the nationalists in a victory he believes was made possible by higher communist morale despite the U.S. support for the nationalists and despite that technology. And the nationalists will flee to Taiwan, like I said, in 1949. They will establish a dictatorship, but later it will become a wealthy liberal democracy. And just like the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries, China had a lot of problems that it had to deal with, right? It was comparatively poor, especially compared to the capitalist liberal democracies. There was a lot of poverty in China. And China, remember, their government falls apart in the 1910s, and then they have off and on again civil war, and then they get invaded by Japan, and then they fight another civil war, right? So they had just been absolutely devastated and having all these wars for decades. And even before that happened, they were already a relatively poor country. So this is a problem that they face. In addition, their goal is not simply to gain some economic wealth and make people's lives better, as you see in that picture. They also want to make a powerful, independent state quickly. There is a concern that the nationalists, still supported by the United States, might try and reconquer the mainland China. There is still, it seems, there's this view that there's a threat, that there's a struggle between the capitalist liberal democracies and communism. And remember, China has this history of being beaten up in the 19th century, right? Remember the Opium War, when the British, with just a few thousand troops and a couple steamships, humiliated the Qing Empire. So this new Chinese Communist government wants to help its people become wealthier, while at the same time making a powerful independent state quickly so it can maintain its security and avoid being beaten up anymore. And what makes things tricky is even among communists, there were disagreements about how to develop. So some communists said, we need gradual development based on technology, right? We're going to work on, this kind of gradual reform and change, and it will improve things eventually. And then you had people who said, no, we need to change quickly because we're under threat and the people are poor and we need to take care of them now. And we don't need to rely that much on technology because we have so many people. And when human beings believe strongly enough in the revolution, if we rely on the revolutionary fervor of the masses, we rely on the peasants, right, and their revolutionary fervor, then there is no telling how far we can go and how quickly we can go. And Mao Zedong is going to argue based on the second point, right? He's going to argue that we can have the rapid development based on the revolutionary fervor of the masses. And he will point out, right, and he has a point, that traditionally, remember, the communists had focused on workers, right? Karl Marx thought that there would be this huge rebellion led by workers. In the Soviet Union, or what's going to become the Soviet Union, Lenin realized there weren't enough workers, but the communists organized them, they could still seize power. Well, Mao Zedong is interesting because he argues, and this makes sense considering China's situation at the time, he argued that it was peasants who would bring the revolution, not workers in factories, but peasants in the field. And a lot of people opposed him, but he turned out to be right. His peasant armies, fired by revolutionary fervor, are going to easily, or I shouldn't say easily, but are going to be able to defeat the nationalist armies who, as I said earlier, had all this advanced technology supplied by the Americans. So Mao Zedong is going to, he's the leader of the Communist Party. He's going to try and focus on this rapid development based on the revolutionary fervor of the masses because he's seen what peasant armies can do, how they can defeat more technologically advanced countries and forces. I said countries because these peasant soldiers are also able to push back UN forces during the Korean War. And sad to say, for the Chinese people, Mao Zedong turns out to be really, really wrong. And he's going to launch 2 failed attempts at bringing transformation based on the peasant masses fired up by revolutionary fervor. The first of these failed attempts was called the Great Leap Forward, which was launched in 1958 and officially ended in 1962. And the theory of the Great Leap Forward was, just like as Mao had done to fight the nationalists, if you rely on the great morale and the hardworking peasants and their revolutionary fervor, their belief in communism, they can make up for their lack of technology. And this picture highlights that. What this picture is showing, you can see those peasants are building furnaces, and they're going to try and make steel in those furnaces, right? So you're taking a bunch of peasants, a good number of whom would not be able to read, and you're telling them to make steel in their backyards with these furnaces. And this does not work, right? For several reasons. One is these people don't know how to make steel, really. And so they don't know what they're doing. So they sometimes do make steel, but it usually tends to be of poor quality. And so that's a problem. This does not actually lead them to produce steel. And to give you another example of why this doesn't work is to make good steel, you need hot fires. But they were trying to make fires just out of wood, and wood does not really burn hot enough to make good, high quality steel. So the Great Leap Forward, the idea was that it was supposed to help the Chinese to advance very quickly in things like steel construction, not by investing in technology, but in relying on the just basically the free work of the peasants and their revolutionary fervor to make up for any technology deficits. So this fails. But in a sense, it's worse than just failing, right? What happens is peasants who are making steel aren't farming, so food production will go down, but people still need to eat. And to actually supply those furnaces, they'll chop down trees, which will lead to erosion and lots of problems there. And they'll even chop down useful trees, like they'll chop down apple trees and pear trees and things like that. And then they won't have access to that food when they need it. And so what happens is that large numbers of people starve to death. And there's also political repression. If you don't support this or you question this, you can get in a lot of trouble. You can be arrested. If you should say, well, we can't make steel this way, you'll be told you don't believe enough in the party. You must be counter-revolutionary. You can be thrown in jail or shot. And it used to be we thought about 25 million people died in this. And remember, about 20 million Chinese people died in World War II. It's thought the early estimates were about 25 million died in the Great Leap Forward. What's really disturbing is more research is conducted. The number only increases, right? At first it's kind of like, oh, those numbers must be inflated. But as people do more research, as China becomes a little bit more open, it turns out that more people died. And the most recent number I've heard that seems reliable is about 45 million die. So this program will kill more than twice as many Chinese as World War II killed. So not only does this fail to build steel up, it just is a great human tragedy. Now, what I think is really striking about this is Mao Zedong, instead of saying, oh, I made a mistake, maybe we need technology, maybe I was wrong, he said, no, the problem was we weren't revolutionary enough. We were insufficiently revolutionary, right? The culture needs to be changed. We need to completely change the Chinese culture. That was the problem. The problem wasn't my ideas. It's not that my ideas were bad. The problem is that the Chinese people aren't good enough yet. They haven't had enough revolution yet, right? So it's not my ideas. It's the Chinese people that are the problem. And so he launches this thing called the Cultural Revolution. And the Cultural Revolution, he encourages the young, and you'll notice those are all young people surrounding an older person and cutting his hair, and he's got a sign on him humiliating him, and they're basically torturing this poor guy. He tells young people, and I'm talking about like high school and college students, it's right to rebel, rise up against your teachers, rise up against anyone in authority except for me, and because those people in authority, they're still part of the old system, and we need to build a new China. This only leads to the death of about 1.5 million, so it doesn't kill as many people, but it creates great chaos, right? Because, for example, students, instead of studying, are doing things like this and, attacking people in their homes and accusing them of being counter-revolutionaries and things like that. And the students will actually start fighting each other in order to prove who is more revolutionary and who is the best follower of Mao. And eventually the army has to be called in to prevent a civil war. And China gets really close to a civil war during this time period. So this effort to change China, to revolutionize it so that it can develop rapidly its economy and become a strong state, also doesn't really work. Now, China does have a pretty strong government. I mean, no one invades it and takes it over, but they're not getting that kind of economic development and that kind of technological development that they wanted, right? And this will end with the death of Mao, right? This will end with the death of Mao. So there are a lot of problems still in China, right? The Mao Zedong had thought that he could bring massive changes through revolutionary fervor to China, and he did bring some massive changes, but he didn't bring much economic development, right? In some ways, China either had stayed the same or had even fallen back. Things had gotten worse, and tens of millions of people had died without really anything good to show for it in many ways. So there is an admission that there needs to be changed. There needs to be change. That maybe that more gradual way of change through technology would be better. And you have a man who's interesting that will rise to power, another communist leader named Deng Xiaoping. And you can think of Deng Xiaoping as being similar than Gorbachev, but also different. Remember Gorbachev, Gorbachev comes to power in a Soviet Union, a communist state that has problems, and he tries to bring political and economic reform, and the whole system falls apart. Deng Xiaoping is similar in that he is a communist leader who comes to power when serious reform is needed, but he is against any kind of liberal reforms in terms of politics, but he does want economic reform, right? He does want economic reform. So he will allow things like markets and the private management of businesses and farms. So basically, China is going to move away from a totally centralized economy. They will allow for decentralization in some places. They will allow for greater efficiency in places, right? So they're going to move away from a centralized economy in some key ways to allow entrepreneurs, for example, to come into existence and allow management and of farms and businesses to be conducted by people who are experts in business rather than government officials. And what's really striking, and you can see his kind of caution here, but also this kind of strategy and this willingness to experiment, is that China will open what are called special economic zones. And these are typically in cities on the ports, so places like Shanghai. And they will allow direct foreign investment here. They will allow a kind of capitalist economy to develop. And then a lot of foreigners want to build factories in China because you have relatively cheap, disciplined workers. And basically the idea is that China is going to allow this investment to build factories and things like that, to make money, and then invest that money in developing its infrastructure and its businesses and all that. So you're going to have what we would call export-led development. China is going to make stuff using its through foreign investment, using its comparative advantage of cheap labor, sell the stuff, make a profit, and plow that into developing its economy further. And this works really, really, really well in many ways. China's economy will start having double-digit growth before too long. And it will sustain that double-digit growth for several decades. Right? So this more gradual work of economic reform and development is going to start working really well for China. Now, in order to understand what happens next, I need to talk about a little place called, or I shouldn't say a little place, a gigantic place called Tiananmen Square, right? So that there is the Forbidden City. That is where and it's in Beijing, and that's where the emperor used to live when there was still an emperor. And you can see there's a picture, a large picture about in the center of the center of that gate. That's Mao Zedong. His picture is still there. And what's interesting is that what will happen is the communists have the opportunity to transform Beijing when they take over. They will make a gigantic open area, and this is called Tiananmen Square, which basically means something like the gate of peace. And this is this place where people can come and have a good time and just relax and chat with their friends. And this is really nice when you're in a city that's crowded to have this area where people can just hang around and have a good time. And also when they want to have like a parade or some kind of communist rally or something, they have it there in Tiananmen Square. And so this is an important place. And it's important politically, I want to stress. This is when they have like the announcement of the founding of the People's Republic of China. That's where they had it. So this is a social space where people come and socialize and have a good time, but it's also a very important political place. Now, in terms of just raw statistics, things are just really going well in China, right? You have massive economic development. You have all these wonderful things happening, and it looks great on paper. But there's problems. Right? There's problems. Economic development is uneven. Right? Economic development is uneven. So if you live in Shanghai in one of those special economic zones, you had a much better chance of getting a relatively high-paying job at a foreign-run factory, and you're maybe making a lot of money now because you live in that foreign economic zone. But if you live in inland China, you don't have that opportunity. So whereas you had in the past Chinese people were relatively equally poor, you're going to have now some Chinese people getting pretty wealthy, whereas other Chinese people are going to stay not as wealthy, are going to stay relatively poor, and are not going to have access to those jobs that are making those other Chinese people rich. So there is real economic development, and some people are getting wealthy, but other people aren't. And the people who aren't are kind of frustrated. Why are they being left out of this economic development? There's also kind of a new problem in China. China had, it didn't always work 100%, but China had some idea of what was called the Iron Rice Bowl. And what that meant was the government was going to take care of you and make sure that you have a job. It didn't always work. But the idea, and this did work much of the time in China, was that you would have a job that would provide for your basic needs. Just like with the Soviet Union, though not as well, and with some exceptions such as the Great Leap Forward, the government did make sure that you had some housing and basic food. And this was done through making sure that you had a job. Now, your job may be terrible. It may be pointless, but you had a job. And just to give you one example, remember that this originally was a centralized economy, so the factories were typically owned and run by the government. And those factories were run not to be economically efficient to make a profit, but to make sure that everyone had a job. So sometimes there would be like a factory that made shirts, and they would have 50 people inspect the same shirt. I mean, I'm not kidding. They would pass the shirt to 50 people to have each one make sure the shirt was a good shirt and could be sold. And that's just making a job so people have jobs. That's terribly inefficient. But it served the purpose of making sure that people had jobs. Now, once Deng Xiaoping brings in these market changes, these market reforms, they get rid of that. They start saying, you know what, we only need one person to inspect shirts, so we're going to fire the other 49. So now China has a new problem, unemployment, right? In order to have economic efficiency, they get rid of jobs that aren't necessary in order to drive down prices so they can sell more stuff on a foreign market. So now there's a lot of people who are nervous that they might lose their job. There's people who've actually lost their jobs and are really upset. And there's students in college who are studying but are afraid that there may not be jobs later. And remember how we talked about problems of corruption in the Soviet Union? You had similar problems of corruption in China. What's particularly striking, though, is, of course, these issues of corruption became really big because people, as you underwent these economic reforms, people within the Communist Party made sure that they used their positions to enrich themselves and their relatives. So, for example, you want to make sure that you're an entrepreneur in China who wants to start a business and you need the government's permission to do that. You're going to need to pay some bribes if you want your business to start. And you may have to employ the nephew of the Communist Party official who's in charge of deciding whether or not your business gets to start. And if you lack those connections, you're scared because you know it's going to be hard for you to get a good job because you don't have those connections. Because of the corruption, someone else is going to get that job. So it's not fair. So you have all these economic fears and concerns, and this will lead to calls for liberal democracy. So in 1989, in Tiananmen Square, remember this very important political and social space, a large number of students will gather together and start protesting and will refuse to leave. And they will say, we want change. We want democracy. We want reform. And one thing that's really striking, if you look at that picture there, they build a statue that looks like that. That's not the original statue. That is a reproduction of the statue that's at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. Has a very large Chinese population, and they had it built there on the university campus. I used to walk by it all the time because my PhD is from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And they built this and they called it the Goddess of Democracy. But that's clearly a reference to the Statue of Liberty. So these students are having protests basically calling for American-style democracy. Now, student protesters are one thing. I mean, it is a serious issue. But the thing about student protests that's very important is often students get the ball rolling, but then other people will join them. And suddenly non-students started supporting and joining these students. And what's really striking was workers started joining these students. Now remember, this is a communist government. Communist governments are supposed to exist for the good of the workers. And now you have workers joining an anti-communist government protest. This goes on, like I say, for weeks. Finally, the government formally orders the protesters to leave. It's brought in military units. It's brought in a lot of soldiers and has told the protesters, you guys need to get out or we're going to let the military loose on you. And the protesters do agree to leave, but violence breaks out as they do. And between 241, that's the official government response, to maybe over 2,500 people die. That's both soldiers and students. Some of the students fought back, and some even managed to get firearms and were shooting back at the soldiers. It's hard to know what is true because from the Chinese government's perspective, this is really bad, right? This is a time when their government was challenged. And so you can't go into China and really do research on this, at least not openly. And if you were to ask Chinese people about it, a lot of them have never heard of it. And even if they have, they don't really want to talk about it, right? But here you have Deng Xiaoping has undertaken these economic reforms, and they've created changes in China that have led some Chinese to call for democracy. However, this call for democracy is crushed. So we can see that the Communist government of China rejected liberal democracy in favor of Communist Party rule. So in a sense, they rejected liberal democracy while keeping capitalism, which I think is interesting. And that's basically the system that still exists in China to this day. So why is China still around while the Soviet Union fell? Well, as we saw previously, they did manage to crush the movement, right? They were able to have some loyal troops who put down the democracy movement. But remember, the democracy movement in Tiananmen Square was fundamentally based around calls for economic change, right? It was based on economic problems. And the People's Republic of China, Communist China, was willing and able to reform the economy. They continued to make the country wealthier, right? Their economic policies continued to increase the wealth of the country, double-digit growth rates for several decades. It's no longer quite that high, but still pretty high. And they made sure that that growing wealth was distributed more equally, right? They made sure that that growing wealth was distributed more equally. They worked harder to make sure people were able to get jobs and the unemployment would go down. And remember, one problem was corruption. They launched anti-corruption campaigns, and every so often, China will have an anti-corruption campaign. So that helps them deal with their problems, right? That helps them to deal with their problems. Remember, what was fundamentally fueling this call for political freedom was economic concerns. They have, to a large extent, addressed those concerns. And Chinese people, in many ways, are unbelievably wealthy compared to just 20, 30 years ago. In addition, and this is one of those things I think is fascinating, the saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The Communist Party is relatively open. If you're a young Chinese person, you can become a member of the Communist Party, right? If you play your cards right, if you focus on that being your goal, you have a good chance of being able to join the Communist Party. And you can become part of the system rather than fighting it. And that seems like a kind of a reasonable thing to do, right? I may not like everything about the Communist Party. I don't like necessarily what they're doing in China. Why don't I become a member of the Communist Party? And then I can become a part of the solution within the party. And doesn't that sound a lot like the exam system? Remember how the exam system in China, the Confucian-based exam system, began with this idea that we're going to try and use this to recruit honest people and good people to help rule, but it also helped prevent rebellion because it made sure that people who might otherwise be rebels could join. Remember that big leader, rebel leader Hong Xiuquan? One reason he rebelled was because he couldn't pass the exams. He would have passed the exams, he probably wouldn't have led his rebellion. So by opening up the Communist Party and this willingness to share power, people are much more likely to try and work within the system than change it. Or I'm sorry, to work within the system and change it rather than trying to overthrow the system. And so in a sense, remember how I said capitalist liberal democracy was able to deal with the problems people faced, and that gave them hope in the system. Present day China is doing that as well through these various means. Now, also, I should stress they don't focus that much on communism. Usually China will talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics or communism with Chinese characteristics, and that's a way of kind of saying, we're going to do what we want to do, even if it's not orthodox communism. As long as it works and to keep us in power, we're going to keep following it. And as part of this, they tend to focus on nationalism. So, for example, the Chinese Communist Party will emphasize this idea that without the Communist Party, there is no new China. In 1842, we were terribly defeated by the British in the Opium Wars. But in 1949, and before 1949, we were often bullied and looked down upon and beaten up by the Western and the Japanese imperialists. But since then, people have had to take us seriously. So we have made China strong. So they can argue, look, we've made China strong. We've made China rich. Why do you want to change? And if you don't like how we're doing things, become a member of the party and help guide us and do your part to help make things go better. So China has shown that it is willing and able to reform its system while still keeping a communist system in many respects. Now, if you challenge the system, you can be censored. I think it's interesting that you cannot legally watch YouTube in China, so the government does try and control what its people know. A lot of Chinese still watch YouTube anyway. They figure out ways around it. But there is censorship and punishment for those who challenge the system. However, you can still criticize the government as long as you're careful about doing it, right? And so while there's some censorship, Chinese people know how to play by the rules a lot of the time and not go to that far, and they can still kind of criticize the government in some ways. And other than that, there's a good deal of freedom. Unlike in the Soviet Union, in China, you can buy jeans, right? A lot of people enjoy a lot of day-to-day freedom, and so they're willing to live with this system. So what's interesting now is we can call this, we had this very interesting system in China. I don't really want to call it communist. I mean, it's ruled by a communist country, but as we can see, I mean, they've adopted capitalism and so forth. So I don't like to call it communism so much, or straight communism. We have here an authoritarian government. It's not a liberal democracy with a capitalist economy. And a way we can think about that when it's run by a communist party is as red capitalism. Right? So China follows a strategy of an authoritarian government, not a liberal democratic government, but a capitalist economy, which we call red capitalism. And so the future, where does it lie? Right? Many people like myself, when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, we said, well, this is a victory for capitalist liberal democracy. We were only half right. It was not so much a victory for liberal democracy, but it was a victory for capitalism. So in a sense, the question now that faces humanity to a large degree is the future. Is it going to be capitalist liberal democracy? Or is it going to be authoritarian capitalism? Is the world going to look more like the United States and Great Britain and France and Germany, the South Korea, Taiwan? Or is it going to look more like the People's Republic of China and follow a system of authoritarian capitalism? Right? In a sense, that's the kind of big question that people face today. So now you've made it through this class, at least the lecture portion of this class, and here's the part where you get to take over, right? Looking at this Calvin and Hobbes comic, right? Calvin is saying all of history up to this point has been spent preparing the world for my presence. Hobbes doesn't really trust Calvin's ability, says, 4.5 billion years probably wasn't long enough. But now the world has been preparing for your existence, right? And as you complete this course, as you complete your degree, as you follow through and develop in your career after college, you're going to find yourself with more and more power, with more and more authority. And it's my hope that this class has given you some wisdom through knowledge of the past to help you understand what has worked in the past, what hasn't, and that will help you to be a morally responsible person. So you'll work not just for your own good, but the good for others as you deal with the problems that I've outlined in this lecture and the problems that will no doubt creep up after that. And I know a lot of this class has been depressing, has been sad, and you will no doubt face struggles, you will no doubt face suffering. But the key thing is we've made it this far, and I think that we will continue to be able to continue forward. And it will be you who will, in a sense, pick up that flag and keep marching forward as human history continues to develop. And you will have your own role to play in that. And my hope this class has helped you prepare so that you can play a positive role in the future. So thank you for taking this class, and good luck with the final exam and any other assignments that are due.